a broken childhood that built an unbreakable man. Chris Gardner's story is not just about success. It is a story about survival, endurance, and the quiet decision to never give up, even when life gives you every reason to do so. Chris Gardner was born on February 9, 1954, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There was nothing glamorous about his early life. No safety, no stability, no financial comfort. His mother, Betty Jean Gardner, was a strong woman, but strength alone could not protect her from the harsh realities of poverty and abuse. Chris never really knew his biological father. That absence left a deep emotional gap in his childhood. Growing up without a father figure made him constantly question his own worth. Like many children in broken homes, he quietly wondered if his life would have been different had someone been there to guide him. When Chris was still very young, his mother married a man named Freddie Tidwell. That decision would turn Chris's home into a place of fear. Freddie was abusive, controlling, and violent. He did not just hurt Chris's mother. He mentally and physically abused Chris as well. Home became unpredictable. Silence meant danger. Noise meant violence. Chris learned early how to stay quiet, how to observe, and how to survive. He watched his mother being beaten. He watched police officers enter his home more than once. He watched fear become part of daily life. These were not moments a child should experience, but they shaped the man Chris would later become. Instead of turning angry or destructive, Chris began to observe human behavior. He noticed how power worked. He noticed how fear controlled people. And deep inside, a promise was forming. No one will ever control my life like this. Eventually, the abuse reached a breaking point. Chris's mother tried to escape the relationship, but leaving was not easy. Without money or support, the system moved slowly. At times, Chris and his mother were separated and placed into foster care. For Chris, this was devastating. New homes, new rules, new beds, no sense of belonging. He learned very early that nothing in life was guaranteed, not even a place to sleep. Yet, something powerful happened during those years. Chris learned self-reliance. When no one is coming to save you, you either fall apart or you grow up fast. School became his escape. Books gave him structure. Learning gave him control. Teachers noticed that Chris was intelligent, especially with numbers. Math made sense to him in a world that often didn't. Numbers were honest. They followed rules. They didn't lie. Chris was quiet, focused, and emotionally guarded. He didn't trust easily, but he was deeply motivated to build a different future from the one he was born into. As a teenager, Chris made a silent decision. He would not let his past define his future. After high school, Chris joined the United States Navy. This choice wasn't just about a career, it was about discipline and structure. The Navy gave him order, responsibility, and a sense of direction he had never known before. During his time in the Navy, Chris worked in the medical field. He interacted with doctors, surgeons, and medical professionals. For the first time, he was exposed to people who were respected, confident, and financially stable. He paid attention. He listened. He learned. While stationed in San Francisco, Chris noticed something that would quietly change his life. A doctor was using a high-tech medical imaging device, far more advanced than standard X-ray machines. The device was expensive, but incredibly effective. Chris asked a simple question. Why is this machine so valuable? That question opened his mind to opportunity. He realized that hospitals needed better technology, but many lacked sales support, education, and service. Chris began to see the gap between innovation and access. And where there is a gap, there is opportunity. After leaving the Navy, Chris made a bold move. He invested his savings into purchasing medical scanning devices and began selling them to hospitals. He had no business degree, no mentors, no financial safety net, just belief. At first, things seemed promising. Some doctors were interested. Some hospitals listened. Chris worked long hours, drove across cities, and did everything himself: sales, delivery, and maintenance. During this period, Chris met Sherry Dyson, a kind and intelligent woman. They fell in love and eventually got married. For a brief moment, life felt stable, like the struggle was finally paying off. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. The machines were expensive. Payments from hospitals were slow. Bills began piling up. Stress entered the marriage. Arguments replaced hope. The dream started to crack. Chris was working harder than ever, yet falling further behind. And then, everything collapsed. Unpaid rent, mounting debt, broken relationships. The business was failing. His marriage began to fall apart. Chris Gardner was about to enter the darkest chapter of his life, homelessness. But what he didn't know yet was this: the man sleeping on benches would one day stand on Wall Street, and the world would call him successful. Chris Gardner's life was unraveling. Despite working tirelessly as a medical device salesman, the bills were mounting faster than he could pay. Hospitals were slow to settle invoices, and every setback felt like the universe was testing his endurance. His marriage with Sherry Dyson began to strain under the pressure. Arguments were frequent, trust eroded, and the emotional support that once existed vanished. Financial stress magnified personal issues, and eventually Sherry left. Chris was now a single father, responsible for his young son, Christopher Jr., with no partner, no stable income, and increasingly limited options. Life had dealt him another cruel hand. Chris was forced to confront a terrifying reality. He and his son had nowhere to live. For months, Chris navigated the streets of San Francisco, searching for a place to sleep and basic security for his son. Homelessness became his reality. They stayed in shelters, subway stations, and public restrooms. Every night was a gamble. Would there be a bed available? Would someone recognize him and offer help? Or would they be turned away once again? Despite the grim circumstances, Chris refused to surrender to despair. His core belief, forged in childhood, kept him going. I will not allow circumstances to define me or my son. Chris's days were a relentless cycle of hustling and survival. During business hours, he visited hospitals, clinics, and offices trying to make sales. By night, he sought temporary shelter for his son and himself, often carrying Christopher Jr. through the cold streets of the city. Imagine the scene. A man in a suit, carrying a briefcase in one hand, and his toddler in the other, walking miles across the city to ensure his child had somewhere to sleep. For Chris, there was no shame, only determination. Every rejection at a hospital, every skeptical glance, every closed door was just another reason to fight harder. Chris understood that success would not come from luck. It would come from grit, persistence, and strategy. He started developing a meticulous plan to change his life. Every night, he reviewed his contacts, mapped hospital leads, and studied competitors. He was relentless in his pursuit of knowledge. But the nights were hardest. Shelters were crowded, cold, and often unsafe. Chris and his son sometimes had to sleep in public bathrooms or subway stations. Chris would hold his son close, whispering words of comfort, while inside, he grappled with fear and uncertainty. Yet, he never let Christopher Jr. see despair. "Daddy's got this," he would say, convincing himself as much as his son. During this time, Chris encountered moments of profound humanity. Strangers sometimes offered a warm meal, a kind word, or temporary shelter. These moments reinforced his belief that persistence paired with kindness could create opportunities even in the darkest circumstances. Chris knew he needed a breakthrough, something drastic to pivot his life. That opportunity came in the form of a competitive internship at Dean Witter Reynolds, a prestigious Wall Street brokerage firm. The internship was unpaid, highly selective, and extremely demanding. But Chris saw it as the ticket out of poverty. He applied relentlessly. The competition was fierce. Hundreds of candidates were vying for just a handful of positions. Many had formal education, experience, and financial support. Chris had none of these. All he had was raw determination and the ability to outwork anyone. Even after securing an interview, Chris faced a critical dilemma. How would he attend? How would he appear professional without money for a proper suit, transportation, or even lunch? Yet he improvised. Using every scrap of resourcefulness he had, Chris dressed as well as he could, carried what little he owned, and walked into that interview with unshakable confidence. Chris's determination impressed the interviewers. Despite his lack of formal credentials, his drive, clarity, and intelligence stood out. He was admitted into the internship, which was essentially a grueling competitive training program for aspiring brokers. But the challenges didn't end there. The internship demanded 12 to 14-hour days. Chris still had to care for his son. Nights in shelters were cold and uncomfortable. Days were exhausting. He balanced meetings, client visits, and studying market reports with feeding, clothing, and comforting Christopher Jr. There were moments when Chris considered giving up. Moments when exhaustion, hunger, and fear threatened to break him. But each time, he reminded himself of a key principle he had learned from his childhood. Your past does not dictate your future. Chris's life during these months was a masterclass in resilience. He became an expert in time management, networking, and negotiation. Every sale he made, every connection he built, brought him one step closer to stability. Every night spent in a shelter became a motivator, a reminder of why he was fighting. Slowly but surely, Chris began to gain traction. Hospitals that had once ignored him started responding. Mentors at Dean Witter noticed his dedication. His sales numbers began improving. And yet, the underlying truth remained. Chris Gardner's rise to success was not fueled by talent alone. It was powered by love for his son, sheer grit, and an unbreakable belief in himself. As the weeks turned into months, Chris's situation gradually transformed. He still faced homelessness, still worried about rent and bills, but he had direction, purpose, and a plan. He had learned how to convert rejection into lessons, setbacks into motivation, and obstacles into opportunity. By the end of this chapter in his life, Chris Gardner had proven to himself something profound. No circumstance, no matter how bleak, is stronger than your determination to succeed. By the time Chris Gardner officially started the internship at Dean Witter Reynolds, his life had reached a level of difficulty most people could not imagine, let alone survive. By day, he was an unpaid intern competing against some of the smartest, most privileged candidates in the country. By night, he was a homeless father trying to keep his young son safe, warm, and fed. This was not just a job. This was a fight for survival. The internship program was brutal by design. Only a small number of interns would be offered a full-time position at the end. Everyone knew it. The pressure was intentional. The company wanted to see who could perform under extreme stress. Most interns had college degrees from top universities. Many had financial support from family. They could focus entirely on learning the business. Chris had none of that. He had no money, no home, no safety net. What he did have was urgency. Every single day mattered. Every phone call mattered. Every opportunity could be the one that saved his life. Chris arrived earlier than everyone else and stayed later than anyone. He memorized scripts. He studied market data late into the night. He practiced sales conversations until his voice was hoarse. But the hardest part was managing time. Chris quickly realized that success in the program depended on one thing: how many productive calls you could make per day. The more people you reached, the higher your chances of landing clients. So Chris changed his strategy. While other interns wasted time between calls, Chris became incredibly efficient. He cut out small talk. He avoided distractions. He made calls back-to-back with laser focus. He didn't work harder, he worked smarter. Slowly, his numbers started to rise. Supervisors began to notice. But outside the office, reality was unforgiving. Chris and his son were still homeless. Every afternoon, Chris would leave the office on time. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to rush across the city to secure a bed at a shelter before it filled up. If he arrived late, they would be turned away. Some nights, there were no beds. On those nights, Chris did whatever he could to protect his son. One evening, with nowhere else to go, Chris and his son took shelter in a public subway station bathroom. Chris locked the door, sat on the floor, and held his child while people passed outside. That night, Chris cried silently. Not because he was weak, but because he was human. And yet, the next morning, he put on his suit, straightened his posture, and walked back into Dean Witter as if nothing had happened. No one at work knew the truth. Chris understood something deeply important. Pity would not save him. Performance would. He refused to be seen as a victim. He refused to let his circumstances lower expectations, including his own. During this time, Chris built relationships carefully. He listened more than he spoke. He learned from experienced brokers. He absorbed everything: sales psychology, investment strategies, client trust building. He treated every interaction as if his future depended on it. Because it did. At home, wherever home happened to be that night, Chris focused on one thing: his son. Christopher Jr. became his anchor. Chris made sure his son felt loved, safe, and hopeful, even when reality was harsh. They talked about dinosaurs, superheroes, and dreams. Chris turned their struggle into a game, shielding his child from the weight of their situation. That love gave Chris strength. Weeks passed, then months. The internship moved closer to its final stage. One by one, interns were eliminated. Some quit under pressure. Some failed to meet targets. Some simply couldn't handle the stress. Chris stayed. His performance was now among the top candidates. Still, nothing was guaranteed. Toward the end of the program, Chris faced his biggest test. He was called into a meeting with senior management. For a brief moment, fear crept in. Was this the end? Was he about to be cut? Instead, he was told something unexpected. They were impressed, not just with his numbers, but with his discipline, focus, and consistency. They saw something rare in Chris: resilience. But there was one final hurdle. Only one position remained. Chris went home that night knowing his entire future depended on one decision. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat quietly, watching his son breathe, replaying every moment of his journey. The abuse, the foster homes, the Navy, the failed business, the streets, the shelters, the bathroom floor. He promised himself that no matter what happened, he would never regret giving everything he had. The next day, Chris was called into the office. The words that followed would change his life forever. He was offered the job. Chris Gardner had officially earned a full-time position as a stockbroker. For the first time in years, stability was within reach. Paycheck, an apartment, a future. The weight he had been carrying began to lift. Slowly, painfully, but surely. Chris moved into a small apartment with his son. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. A place with a door that locked. A bed, kitchen, a home. But Chris wasn't finished. This job wasn't the end goal, it was the beginning. Chris continued to work relentlessly. He built his client base. He increased his earnings. He refined his skills. Over time, he became one of the most successful brokers at the firm. Eventually, Chris went on to start his own brokerage company. He became a self-made millionaire. Years later, his story would inspire millions around the world. It would become the foundation for the movie, The Pursuit of Happyness. But at its core, Chris Gardner's story was never about money. It was about choice. Chris Gardner's life did not magically become easy the day he received that job offer. What changed was not the absence of struggle. It was the direction of his life. With a stable income finally coming in, Chris moved into a modest apartment with his son. It wasn't luxury, but it represented something far more valuable: security. For the first time in years, Chris could lock a door behind him at night and know his child was safe. But comfort never made Chris complacent. He worked harder than ever. Chris approached his career on Wall Street with the same urgency that once drove him through homeless shelters and subway stations. He studied relentlessly, built strong client relationships, and developed a reputation for honesty, discipline, and performance. While many chased quick money, Chris focused on long-term trust. Over time, his results spoke for themselves. Chris Gardner rose through the ranks and became one of the most respected brokers at his firm. His income grew rapidly, and with it, his confidence. But he never forgot where he came from, or what it felt like to have nothing. Eventually, Chris made another bold move. He started his own brokerage firm, Gardner Rich & Company, taking full ownership of his future. This decision marked his true transformation, from survivor to leader, from employee to entrepreneur. The same man who once slept in public bathrooms was now advising clients on investments, wealth strategy, and financial growth. He had become a self-made millionaire. Yet, money was never the part of the story that mattered most to Chris. What mattered was freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from survival mode. Freedom to choose his future. Chris also understood that his story carried responsibility. He began sharing his journey publicly, not to impress, but to inspire. He spoke openly about homelessness, failure, and rejection. He reminded people that success is not reserved for the lucky. It is earned through persistence, discipline, and belief. In 2006, Chris published his autobiography, The Pursuit of Happyness. The book became a bestseller, touching millions of readers around the world. Soon after, Hollywood took notice. Chris's life story was adapted into the critically acclaimed film, The Pursuit of Happyness, starring Will Smith. The movie introduced Chris Gardner's journey to a global audience and became a symbol of resilience and hope. But Chris often emphasized one important truth. The movie shows the highlight moments. The real journey was far harder. What the film could never fully capture were the silent nights, the constant fear, and the emotional toll of carrying responsibility while having nothing. Chris made sure his son grew up knowing one thing above all else. Your circumstances are temporary. Your mindset is permanent. As the years passed, Chris Gardner expanded his impact beyond finance. He became a motivational speaker, an advocate for homelessness awareness, and a mentor to aspiring entrepreneurs. He used his success to give back, supporting charities, speaking to disadvantaged communities, and encouraging people to take ownership of their lives. Chris never pretended the journey was easy. Instead, he taught practical lessons. Protect your dreams, even when others doubt them. Control what you can control, effort, discipline, attitude. Never let pride stop you from surviving. Your past does not disqualify your future. One of Chris Gardner's most powerful beliefs was simple but life-changing. You don't need permission to succeed. Today, Chris Gardner is recognized not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as a symbol of what the American dream truly represents. Not instant success, but relentless effort in the face of adversity. His story resonates because it is real. No shortcuts, no overnight success, no excuses, just one man, one child, and an unbreakable decision to keep moving forward. And that is the real lesson of Chris Gardner's life. Not that anyone can become rich, but that anyone can refuse to give up. Chris Gardner didn't win because he was lucky. He won because he stayed standing when life tried to break him. If you're still watching this, then this story isn't just about Chris Gardner. It's about you. Your situation may not change today, but your decision can. Subscribe for real stories of real people who turned nothing into something. This is Millions Monthly, where discipline builds destiny.